It is my great honor, privilege, and pleasure to post this video collaboration with Michael Gelb, an author of 17 books, including the international bestseller, How to Think Like Leonardo Da Vinci, 7 Steps to Genius Every Day. Michael's books have been translated into 25 languages and have sold more than 1 million copies. Michael is also a master teacher of the Alexander Technique and a gifted teacher of Tai Chi and Qigong. In addition, he holds a 5th degree black belt in Aikido, and he's a professional juggler who has performed with the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan. In this video, as we talk about the life of Leonardo da Vinci, Michael provides the facts of his life and the insights into his character, while I try to link what I'm hearing to Da Vinci's astrological birth chart. Enjoy. The thing about his chart, as I see it, is that the dominant planet of all the planets, you almost wouldn't expect this, but Pluto, which is the ruler of atomic power. This guy was an atomic man long before atomic power was discovered. And in fact, that's the same planet that inclines people to be fascist, because it's overwhelmingly powerful, and that's the way a fascist thinks. They think, I want all of it. I don't want, that's hence totalitarianism, totality, all. And you do see this in Putin, you see it in Trump, you see it in Hitler. It's this quality of taking it all and being all powerful. In his case, it's placed in a house of knowledge, which immediately tells you what he was honed in on. And it's, on the one hand, probably made him, my guess is he was probably pretty obsessive in his nature, because he would have to be. How else could you do what he was doing? It's crazy. When you read his bio, you think, what was this guy? He was painting, he was creating. He even dabbled in weapons, even though he thought it was a bad idea, but he had that kind of mind where he was so curious. He could be in such different realms, of experience. So that would be again the plutonian totality of focus, but you can see that he's using it in a really positive way, right? That's the difference. He's not thinking about world domination or anything like that.
He's thinking about what all truly great geniuses think about, which is knowing the mind of God. They
Right.
want to understand the totality of the universe.
Right.
Why are we here? What is life? What is death? Why is the sky blue?
Right.
Why does a flower blossom? Why does the wind blow? I mean, you read Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, which I read over and over and over again in preparation for writing How to Think Like Leonardo. And what comes across is really something that's everybody's birthright. We're all born, every child's born with that kind of incredible curiosity. But Leonardo continues it throughout his whole life, focused on what is truth, what is beauty, what is goodness, the Platonic ideals, what is truth, what is goodness, what is beauty, not just as abstract philosophical notions, but what are they really? I want to know. I want to get to the essence of things. So you talked about the obsessive quality, and it's obviously there in the way he pursued all these fields of knowledge. But maybe the most intense example is, can you imagine staying up all night, dissecting bodies from 3 different angles of entry into the body, because he was so curious, he had to see it from different perspectives. That's part of his intellectual methodology. And he had to do it at night because it wasn't effectively legal, even though he was able to do it because he had powerful patrons who sponsored him, but still no modern plumbing, no electricity. He's doing this by candlelight, and some of his anatomical drawings are still used in medical schools today, because we've never had anybody able to portray certain elements of the functioning of the human body more distinctly than Leonardo did over 500 years ago.
That's pretty remarkable. And by the way, you see that as well in his chart. He's got first of all, Pluto alone, being the lord of the underworld, you immediately go to the death realms. But he's got the death house. He has the technology planet in the death house. So he was applying science, basically. And by the way, that's a planet that was discovered in 1790. So well post his life. Same with Pluto, same with Neptune. These are later discoveries. But you see them active in his chart, very active, as a result of his birth. And yeah, it matches perfectly. But he's definitely using the Pluto obsession in a service-oriented way. He's tapping into nuclear power, and it would be the idea of, for example, using nuclear power to solve the planet's problems, if that could be done, as opposed to creating weapons to destroy everybody or to threaten, each other. So that's
what people always ask me, what would he be doing now? He would have already figured out how to generate free energy for everybody.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to come back, because the image is this Pluto quality that you're speaking about, it's one of the stories about Leonardo is he was dealing with helping to nurse a man who was very, very old. They say he was 100 years old, who knows, but he's very, very old. And Leonardo very lovingly, very caringly was with him, nurturing him, ministering to him until his very last breath. And then he dissected him because he wanted to know. He said, what happens at death? What happens? Right? I have to go in and find out. He also gave us the first reasonably accurate drawing of the embryo in the womb, because he wants to know the secret of birth as well. So there he is trying to get to how's life come about? What happens when it's over? It's intense, profound.
That's remarkable. It's totally remarkable. And the thing is that he has illustrates another one of the classic astrology rules. You take a planet like that, and to the sun, it's square, which means it's a driving obsession. And he probably had an awareness of his own demons too, because Pluto energy will take you to the dark side. And he probably had a sense of, this could be bad, and he'd control it and so forth. He obviously did, right? But the interesting thing is, square the sun for the drive, but he had a trine, a 120 to his Mercury. So that's a naturally brilliant mind. That's someone who knows immediately to dig underneath, and rather than saying this is the way things are, he's asking, well, what's underneath? What's causing this to work in this way? Which is what makes for great scientists, because otherwise you're not doing true measurement. By the way, another thing, he has the Einstein signature in that he had the mind planet connected to Pluto for the brilliance, but opposite Saturn for obsessive counting and measuring, which is really important, because if you don't have that,
right,
again, you can be incredibly brilliant, but you're not going to do the data part, and then you won't be able to measure properly, and then you can't get the proper answers, right? So
that's so perfect that you illuminate that, because the fifth principle for thinking like Leonardo is arte scienza, which is Italian for art and science. And generally, the reason we think of Leonardo as perhaps the greatest genius to ever live is he was such a genius of both art and science, and for him, they weren't separate. So he had that incredible imagination, but then he was able to do the detailed discipline work to make it real, to ground it, just like Einstein did. Einstein went off and had these fabulous, he called them thought games, these imagination games where he'd imagine surfing out on a sunbeam into the universe. But after he intuited that the whole universe was this phenomenon that was effectively curved, that space was curved, he was able to translate that into a few very simple equations that then were able to generate accurate predictions which is how you actually win a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, it was the curve, that discovery of the curvature. It predicted that light would bend, and then when something about Mercury and the timing proved that what he was saying was correct. Yeah.
But you got to remember that Leonardo's doing all this before there is contemporary science,
Right.
before there is contemporary physics or biology or chemistry, before he was right there. He's before Galileo. So he's right there at the birth of this consciousness that says, how do we really analyze, measure, monitor, and understand our world without relying on superstition and pure mythology?
I mean, it's remarkable too that you see in his chart, you see this, I don't know if you can call them conflicts, or you could just say the different traits and how they try to align together. But you see that the impulse to be a scientist, to be curious and see things as they are, is immediately, especially then, immediately in conflict with the fact that you should believe in certain things, and you ought not to voice something that could be true but controversial because it runs counter to the established thinking. And one of the things that he said before Galileo, that the sun doesn't move. It's the earth that moves. Right. Now, he actually didn't get that right, because I guess that's the limit of the imagination, that he got right that it was the earth that was moving. What he didn't realize is that the sun moves even faster than the earth. It's just that it's not moving around where people thought, right? And that came later. And even Einstein didn't figure this out, really. So you can't fault him for that. But what you can see in Da Vinci's chart is that he has a definite, there's a conjunction, Jupiter moon. Jupiter moon in Pisces is much more likely to be a painter than a scientist. The thing is that he was a painter and a scientist. And it was because the other part of the chart, the Uranus, which is the scientist and the rebel, Uranus will say, I'm not going to accept the standard thinking here. Something about it is wrong. Uranus is the next planet out from Saturn. It rebels against the established norms and structures. So that Uranus is the most dynamic in his chart, actually. It's part of this formation with 3 planets. So it really drives his energy. But then there's that other thing with Jupiter moon, which is very artistic and very compassionate too. Jupiter moon in Pisces is a spirit energy, a sense of the unity of all things, as you put it earlier, the one consciousness, one energy. So all of that in the chart, but he was able to navigate it without, getting lost in one or the other, integrating. I mean, it is pretty strange to think someone is painting traditional, because the things he painted were fairly traditional, right?
Yes.
In a way, they were religious. And then he turns around and he does dissections in the middle of the night. It's amazingly, amazingly varied. Let's just say that.
He himself, he wasn't religious per se, but he was profoundly spiritual, and he was rebelling against the mindlessness of some of the strictures that were imposed upon people in the Middle Ages. Most importantly, the notion that all knowledge was already known.
Yeah. That's funny. That's funny.
Right.
Think about it now. That's pretty funny.
So that didn't work for him. And you're right. It's fascinating that the stars show what is a distinctive quality of Leonardo, which is his love for all beings, for all creatures. That, one of the stories that Vasari is the first real art historian. He wrote this classic book called The Lives of the Artists. And one of the classic stories of Leonardo is that whenever he would get a commission for a painting, he would have a little pocket money. He would walk along in the streets of Florence, and he would find wherever there were merchants selling caged birds. And he would pay the merchant and open the cage and let the bird fly free. And it's just such a perfect metaphor for Leonardo's affirmation of life, and something that goes throughout his work and his notebooks is his reverence for nature. And he says that, if you have, in contemporary terms, he would say, if you have an issue, if you have a problem, if you're having something you need to work out, he'd say, go straight to nature for the solution.
Yeah, liberate a bird, and maybe nature will liberate you. It's interesting too that Jupiter Moon conjunction in certain charts, especially if it has challenging connections, but even if it doesn't, depending on the person's orientation, can lead to indulgence, and so as a result, wouldn't be good for health. The thing is, he was born with the sun in the house of health. So that's another thing that I'm pretty sure this guy was constantly focused on his own health, the way his own body was working. I think that's probably what led him in some ways to all those studies, because he was probably, really curious as to what it was that, like that famous, it's not a koan, but it's the question that you use in deep Zen inquiry, which is, you just say to yourself, what is this? But it's a what is this in big, big letters, as in, what is this? What is happening to me? And like, what is this existence? What is this that we are? And my sense is he would have, obviously, being a really intelligent man, realized, something is happening here. There's this body, there's this energy. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. And so then, as a result, because of that position of the sun, he would be unlikely to drift into indulgence, which could then damage the body, hurt his health and so forth. That's my best guess.
No, well, this is the sixth principle for thinking like Leonardo da Vinci, corporalita, and it's to balance the body and the mind. So we know, of course, of Leonardo as a genius of science and of art and of invention, but he was also renowned for his physical gifts. So he was incredibly graceful, and Vasari says he was the strongest man in Florence.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
He was an amazing athlete, a fencer, an equestrian. I was thrilled to discover that he was even a juggler, because that's how I worked my way through graduate school, as a professional juggler. No kidding.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah. But we all know Leonardo. This principle is familiar to everybody who's seen the Vitruvian Man, the beautiful drawing that he did for his friend's book. So that book was a book about divine proportion. And it was based on the work of Vitruvius, the Roman architect. And the idea was that the human body is a microcosm of the whole universe, the macrocosm, and that the harmony of the universe is expressed in each of us. This is such a essential notion of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is the rebirth of this notion of human power and potentiality. And Leonardo captured all of that in this one sketch for his friend's book. And nobody remembers his friend's book, but Leonardo's sketch is the logo for yoga studios and Pilates studios and massage therapy studios all over the world. It's on the €1 coin. So here it is, 570 years later, the symbol of the integration of body, mind, of health, of wholeness. And Leonardo actually gives advice in his notebooks to his students. He says, learn to preserve your own health. Well, today we call that holistic health. He says, avoid grievous moods and keep your mind cheerful. Well, today we call that psychoneuroimmunology, the notion that your attitude affects your immune system from moment to moment. He says, eat a healthy, wholesome diet of the freshest foods that you can find.
He says that.
Savor dining with your friends, like the Italians say, a tavola non si invecchia. When you dine with friends, you don't grow old. He says, get some moderate exercise every day, have a little red wine with dinner, drink plenty of water, get lots of rest. What else do you need to know?
Yeah, in a way, that's the same teaching as today. It's not different. It's the essence of things.
The essence of things. He expressed it in his notebooks as a memorandum to his students so that they could have the health, because you need what one of the secrets of great genius that people don't realize is it takes a lot of energy.
Right.
It takes a lot of stamina. I mean, if you're going to stay up night after night dissecting bodies, if you are going to catalog plants in a way that nobody had ever done before, if you're going to invent all these machines, and oh yeah, by the way, create some of the greatest masterwork paintings in human history, including The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, which remains the most recognized work of art on the planet.
Yeah, no, clearly what it's telling you is that he had access to a lot of energy, and it's not correct. People will then say, well, it's just the way he was born. My theory is that yes, to an extent it would have been native, but I'm betting he really worked at it. He really understood this needs to be nurtured, protected, and probably helped him a great deal in making his way through to all these different fields, because it takes a lot of energy, to whether it's to paint or to dissect or do whatever, to record. The mind has to be really on. As soon as it starts, the energy starts dropping, you don't get as much done, right? So bottom line with this chart, what I see is an amazing set of planet energies that could easily have gone to the dark side, and yet he found a way to channel them all, in the best possible way. Because is there anything about him that is known that, like a scandal or something that he did that was in some way negative? I'm not aware of that.
Not really, nothing really negative. No, what he did do was to draw and sketch deformed people. He was fascinated with, because he wanted to understand beauty, the heights of beauty, but he realized he was so profound and went so deep. He realized you can't understand beauty without understanding ugliness. So he studied deformity and things that most people would find repulsive and ugly and hideous. He sketched these figures that are a little bit scary, but you can see it's an expression of, we need to know the way things are, and you can't just pretend that these things aren't real. He was, he lived at a time when he lived through, look, the pandemic's been rough, but nothing compared to the bubonic plague, wave after wave, that Leonardo lived through. 30% of the people in Milan dying in very short time when he lived there. And that was just one wave. What was his response? It was to design plans to reorganize cities so that, in today's terms, you would say that there was more social distancing. And I'm not kidding. And greater hygiene. This is before germ theory. He just observed and said, here's a better way to deal with this. This must be associated with these unhygienic, crowded conditions. Here's a way to redesign a city. And he sketches out the redesign of the city. So we know he saw the worst of humanity, because that was the nature of things at the time. Look, he worked for a while for Cesare Borgia, and he was around the captain of the papal armies, who was renowned as a less than pleasant fellow. And he always had to have a patron, because that's the only way you could pursue what he wanted to pursue. So, his first patron were the Medici. Then he moved to Milan under the patronage of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. He was there for about 17 years. Then the French invaded Milan and he became a refugee. he went down to the Vatican for a while, but he wasn't too popular there because he challenged a lot of contemporary thinking of the time, accepted preconceptions and so on. Then he worked for Cesare Borgia for a while. Then he had a second period back with the Medici, and then back to Milan for a while, and spent the last 3 years of his life under the patronage of the French king, Francois I. So he lived. Francois was so enamored of Leonardo, he made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He said, "Come to France." He said, "You will be on retainer to me exclusively. You will be the painter, philosopher, and engineer for the royal house." And Francois built a palace next to his palace in the Loire for Leonardo. So you can imagine how cool it was when I went there, when I was writing the book, literally walked in Leonardo's footsteps, and then went to the window of his bedroom and looked out the window as he would do every day. Imagine, how did Leonardo really see the world? Because this was his view. But what's it like to see like him? So anyway, he saw a lot of the ups and downs and the dark side of humanity. You couldn't get away from it.
Right. Yeah.
In that, between plague and the wars and all sorts of terrible phenomenon, but he was able to navigate through it all and create images that inspire and uplift humanity to this day, and will always do so. He's, one of my criteria for true universal genius, for the great geniuses, is they touch everyone. They're universal, every culture, everybody. Leonardo is the archetype of human potential for people everywhere, everywhere. I hear from people who read the book in Hindi and say how much it meant to them, right? In China, in Latin America, all over the world, right? He's this archetype of human potential.
Yeah, it's super impressive how you can see him using or connecting to, or whatever, whatever the semantics would be, but in the chart where things that can go astray. For example, he's got the part of him that rebels, that allows him to be inquisitive and very curious, and he's digging and he's looking for solutions. The problem with that alignment is that it'll often get you into conflict with, say, for instance, the governmental figures. And this guy sounds to me like someone who I think he was using his Jupiter, Moon, Pisces, Sag rising. The mutable energy in his chart is the adaptability, the flowing, where you kind of do a chameleon thing, and then you find ways to not irritate people at the right times. So in other words, then on top of that, he's a social expert in a way, right? Because he's clever. He's figuring out, I can go this far, but no further. And so then that Saturn, which could have been a problem, turns into an asset. By the way, the reason I think he would have done what you said about the art of deformity, or it's because Saturn in Libra, which is where it was, Libra is the sign of beauty, because Libra is the symmetry. Beauty is the idea that there's a symmetrical pattern, whether it's in the human body or in anything, right? So he's highly attuned to that. But then Uranus squares it. Uranus is challenging that, and in a way is saying, no, well, that's not totally right. And what about if it's not true? So then he's looking at it that way. But as I say, he could have mangled that. He could have mangled that and then created problems for himself. And then what he's doing is, with the Saturn rules his money house, which is, it's Capricorn. And Capricorn is the high society. If you're getting patrons or government assistance, that's what that is. But normally when I look at a chart like his, I would think, I think maybe that's not going to work. So it's amazing that in this case, he made that work as well. It's remarkable.
It's so cool that you point that out, because he was really charming, according to all accounts. He loved to tell stories. He was a musician. When he went for his he went. One of the things in the biography of Leonardo in the book, I open it with what I consider to be the world's most amazing employment application letter. It's the letter Leonardo wrote when he was 30 years old. He'd been working for the Medici company in Florence, and he wanted to get a job with the Sforza outfit based in Milan. So he's writing to Ludovico Sforza, effectively the CEO and chairman of Milan, saying everything he can do. And he lays out this just amazing, I can build you bridges, I can build you war machines, I can do underwater stuff for you, I can move rivers, I can do a little painting and architecture too. but according to the chroniclers of the time, you have to imagine the scene. Leonardo shows up for his job interview. The letter was good enough. He got into the door to meet the Duke. So Leonardo shows up for his interview, and he brings this beautiful, it's kind of like a lute with a silver horse's head that turns out Leonardo had crafted the whole instrument by hand.
Wow.
He played music for the Duke and composed and sang songs spontaneously to amuse the Duke, and then gave him the instrument as a present. So you can imagine Sforza saying, I'm sure we can find something for this charming young man to do.
Yeah.
And what Leonardo actually had to do in between trying to figure out the mind of God and painting the Last Supper and other great masterpieces, he was effectively working as a conference planner for the Duke. So they would have the Renaissance equivalent of corporate conferences where nobles would come and effectively investors would come and sponsors and funders and so on and so forth. And Leonardo would put together the entertainment. He would do the set designs. He was a chef, so he would help design the menus. It's incredible to think of maybe the greatest genius in human history actually had to earn a living by doing this sort of mundane ephemera.
Yeah, but I mean, it's benign. I mean, the one thing you see in this chart, which is really curious, he's got you can't believe me. You can't talk about Leonardo da Vinci and in any way mention Trump. But the reason I bring up Trump now is that Trump's genius is that he knows how to separate people from their wallets. He's incredibly skillful at building stories that are unbelievably fake, and people give him money. And it's because the eighth sign in a chart, well, yeah, I mean, you can describe it some other way, but it's got that. I mean, I want to ask these Trumpers, remember he was telling you that he's so rich, he doesn't need any money. Why is he asking you for money now? Just think about that. And they give him a lot too. So the eighth sign is, the proverbial, remember that movie with Danny DeVito where he said, well, I like money, but what I really like is other people's money. Other people's money is the eighth sign, right? The sign of in astrology, following the marriage house, it's the partner's money, but it's generally other people's money. So in Leonardo's chart, that is the moon rules that, and Jupiter is next to it. So an astrologer in the Middle Ages would have said, you probably can get people to give you money. You just gotta, if you just do it the right way, that's what will happen. So it's not like it's in his actual money house. Like say in the case of Bill Gates, he's got a very strong personal money situation. And in the case of Da Vinci, it just comes to him through the way he is. Somehow people finance him, which is a little bit like what you're describing, I think, in this case, right? That
yes.
Patronage. And so I doubt that he would have had any problems with money in his life. I would think, I don't know, that'd be my best guess.
Well, it's fascinating because he has shopping lists in his notebooks and he's recording how much everyday items cost. And then he's creating a budget for some of his assistants. And he had one assistant who was, these are young men, and one of them was kind of naughty and spent too much and he's dealing with these everyday sort of things and keeping track of the accounts. But also, he always managed to have a patron. Sometimes there's some questions that they didn't pay him on time, or he didn't deliver the work on time. He was famous, unfortunately, for not always finishing his paintings. And Freud wrote a whole book about Leonardo, saying it was something to do with unresolved stuff about his mother, blah, blah, blah. I think that the reason that Leonardo didn't finish things is because he was aiming for a standard of perfection that was not really attainable. And he was never really satisfied with what he could do. I mean, he writes when he's working on the Last Supper, and the face of Christ in the Last Supper is unfinished. It's still an incredible figure, and the poise, and he captures this quality of the transcendent in this moment. And he also, by the way, is the first painter to capture the moment where Christ says, "One of you shall betray me." That's part of why the painting's so famous, because you see the disciples, and in Leonardo's painting, they're all going like this. Did you hear what he just said? Oh my God. They're like real human beings at a real dinner, as opposed to what you would see in the Middle Ages, which is these two-dimensional figures with a golden halo and a blue lapis lazuli sky looking completely unrealistic. In the Renaissance, what we're saying is people, the divine spark is in people. So these are people. There's no halos in Leonardo's Last Supper. But anyway, he left the face of Christ unfinished, and he wrote in his notebook that he despaired of finding a face so perfect as to be a face that he could use for a model of Christ. So he wasn't in any way irreverent about Christ or about the holy subjects that he was painting. He accepted the power of that imagery, and it was a spiritual expression for him. But he was really, people say, was he competing with Michelangelo, who was 23 years younger, and they were vying for who was the greatest artist at the time? No, he was competing with God. He wanted to create like God created, that perfectly. That's what he was trying to get into. And that's why I think he left a lot of things unfinished.
Well, and and in the astrology, it's interesting that even though this is the kind of astrology that I'll often object to, because I think, it's just these phrases, these catchphrases. Thing is that they're often true, as it turns out. they relate. So one of the things people say about Aries is Aries starts things and won't finish them. Well, the reason is because Aries is the spring sign. It's a cardinal sign, energy bursting. So then you start something and then you lose interest and you start something else. It's cardinal energy. Cardinal starts things, right? Well, Da Vinci had the Pluto trine Mercury. Mercury is the mind, this thing where I said naturally brilliant mind, depth perception, all of that. But Mercury is in Aries. So his mind was an Aries mind, which means he'd be looking at something and then he was just too smart sometimes to continue, because his mind would go to something else and he'd start that. I often tell cardinal people, just start things. Don't worry if you don't finish them, because the right thing will stick eventually. You'll do 10 things and it's your action that leads you to the correct action, rather than being mentally churning and turning and hoping that the perfect vision will come to you and then you'll act. Many times just do it, see what comes back, adjust. Eventually the correct action will happen. And so in his case, again, Mercury in Aries, something I don't know if you knew or not, but well, you don't know it unless I told you, which is this, that he has all his outer planets, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And wait, is it Eris too? Yeah. Okay. So all his outer planets Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, it's 5 planets. Now, keep in mind, he's born in the 15th century, right? They're all in the same sign as your planets. That's pretty unusual. That's pretty strange because now, once you start going to the personal planets, the variance is too much. But Saturn in Libra, Uranus in Cancer, it's pretty remarkable that this would happen. I noticed it when I looked at the charts. So
Cool.
that's your link.
That is cool.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, it's a really remarkable individual. What would you say? So you mentioned a couple of the principles. What would you say is the one that you think is top because he said it was number one, or that you identified it as possibly the most important?
So the principles, I abstracted the principles from my extensive study of his notebooks and his art and talking to the great Da Vinci scholars in the world. And they form a systematic approach to thinking like him. And I took them really I asked myself the question, what's he trying to teach us in his notebooks? Us being his students, who he addresses. My job was to translate it to contemporary terms and then see if there's a system. So it starts with curiosity, which is our birthright of genius, because the questions we ask every day determine the quality of our lives. Then it goes to cultivating your ability to think critically and independently, which he was tremendous exemplar of. All great geniuses are, but you have to imagine at the time that he was born, knowledge was hard to get. Books were rare.
Right.
So, people, why are there stained glass in all the churches? Because that was the way knowledge was communicated. The stories from the Bible, that was the Instagram of the time. Books were just in Latin, which you wouldn't have learned unless you came from a noble family. Leonardo taught himself Latin when he was 40 years old, so he could read those classics. So the ability to think for yourself is the second principle. The third principle is to sharpen all your senses and deepen your appreciation of beauty. The fourth is to embrace uncertainty and the unknown, which is one of the most distinguishing characteristics of genius. It's why Mona Lisa is smiling. How do you resolve that uncertainty? You balance art and science. That's the fifth principle. Then you cultivate your energy. That's corporalita, the sixth principle. And it all leads to the seventh principle, connessione. Everything connects to everything else. So learn to see relationships, patterns, connections. And what is genius? Geniuses are those who see connections that other people don't see and bring them forth to expand our lives aesthetically or practically.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. The thing about relationships in astrology, that's the Libra principle, back again to where his Saturn was. Saturn is exalted in Libra, it likes being there. But if you think about it, it's the Einsteinian principle in action, because relativity is a way of understanding relationships. That was Einstein's whole thing, was that he realized, well, it depends where you are. What are you relating to? Then you get this effect. Otherwise, you get the other effect. So it sounds to me like Leonardo understood the same thing, and he could see that depending on where you were, something else would be true or not. And then this is what allows you to then develop your knowledge, and
literally, it's the beginning of perspective in art. So he was working on the science of perspective, recognizing that the way you see things depends on where you are. So, one of the things that makes the Mona Lisa so amazing is he's the first painter to paint a background as it really appears to the human eye, the way the light fades off and the way things get smaller and fuzzier in the background as we really see them, rather than imposing a stylized idea of how things are supposed to be, which is what a lot of art was previously.
Right. Yeah, it's truly phenomenal, because the thing about Leonardo da Vinci that's amazing is, normally, whatever that means normally, but it's like, you think if someone is really a genius, like a Van Gogh type, they're generally not going to have their life together. They're going to be so, enmeshed. And so, for example, Van Gogh, no disrespect, but it sounds to me like he probably wasn't respecting the sixth principle. There are stories that he was drinking what was effectively poison. And I always think, well, if you're doing that, you can't possibly feel good. Yes, you'll produce art and so forth, but your life will probably be pretty choppy. And it doesn't surprise me that he maybe wasn't getting paid well during his life. Then after he passes, then everybody makes money off his paintings, that kind of thing. But Leonardo found a way to be both this amazing artist, amazing scientist, and a man of the time, who could walk the streets and have people say, this guy is great. I mean, invite him over here, whatever. So
Right.
he's covering all the angles. That to me is what is most amazing, because you can get genius where they'll leave a record or do something for humanity where you appreciate the value, but then you think, wow, this guy was really out of sorts, and he couldn't connect with other people. But it seems like he very well rounded, in other words, very balanced. That's another. You're seeing the Libra principle again, because Libra, these are not invented things. Libra is the scales. He's got the Saturn in that sign, dominant planet, and he obviously knew how to work it, understand it, be it, and he had lots of balance, which on another level is equanimity as well, which would be the connection to spirit, and we know what allow him to come from the depths and so forth. So yeah, quite remarkable, quite a remarkable human being, no doubt about it.
And well, that's also, it's part of why I chose him, because humanity, we all need a role model, an exemplar of using our full abilities, all of our potential, being really wildly creative, and being a fulfilled and happy, healthy person.
True. Yeah, that's the key. I mean, the thing is, if you can't be that, it kind of doesn't matter what you do, because you can achieve all kinds of things, but you won't necessarily enjoy it, and so it won't be a happy life. So that's entirely true. Very, very true. Yeah, I cannot agree more. Now, something else. Here's another. This is the thing about astrology. The synchronicities. They're constantly showing up, right? So you and I talked about doing this today because it's his birthday, right?
Yes.
However, he was born in the old calendar, and I don't totally understand this. I have to study it a little more, but the long and the short of it is that he's a Taurus in that calendar, but now today the sun is in Aries, so it's in the previous sign. I don't totally understand. I have to learn what it is that changed. However, today the sun is in Aries, but we're on a full moon. Essentially, we're not quite there yet, but the full moon will be on, I believe, tomorrow, the next day. But it's already in the signs. The moon is in Libra already, and the sun is in Aries. And we certainly talk plenty about Aries and that. But Libra is this whole thing around relationships, relating, symmetry. All these different things that we brought up during this talk are very Libran, right? And we're basically bringing them out in the inspiration of the full moon, because the full moon is the moment of the high point in the cycle where the energy is brightest, and the principles that the full moon exemplifies are displayed, right? Or exist, come to life. And you'll have to believe me when I tell you that I wasn't planning that part. that only occurred to me now, that it fits like a glove with the entire paradigm. And hopefully when people hear what we're saying here, they'll find the inspiration to pursue some of these principles, because I think they're really amazing and really, really valuable. I definitely, 2 or 3 that I'm 100% committed to. One is the curiosity and just wondering how things are instead of what people say they are, because they may not be. And then the thing about body mind management, I've tried every possible way to get around that, and I can't. I just think it's wired into nature, and there's no way around it. And yet, when you do it, you notice that your life prospers and you feel better. Especially, to me, the greatest prosperity is being able to, you fall asleep at night at peace because your mind and body are in order. You're not conflicted and suffering and so forth. And it's just through what you're doing, through your own self-management. That to me is one of the greatest gifts, that one can discover. Let's say that.
Well, Leonardo would agree with you. And actually, I have him right here. And first of all, he has a couple of messages for you, because some people may discover that in Leonardo's notebooks, he can be rather critical of astrologers because he thought it was part of the superstition of the time. But I'm in touch with him, and he told me that you've changed his mind.
Really?
And that he appreciates you doing his chart. And helping people think like him. So on behalf of Leonardo and myself, grazie mille. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, you're most welcome. This is where, this is where you see the unexplained pattern and so forth. Because I often think in my own, biased mind, I think astrology is more than scientific enough that a person with any kind of mind would immediately notice patterns. But I can also accept that, you can't do absolutely everything. I'm amazed at what he already did. It's pretty crazy, pretty remarkable. It's almost supernatural, when you consider the rounded, the fields he was covering. They're so disparate too. So he didn't get to astrology. It's fine. I mean, quite frankly, I think if he had been a great astrologer, he probably wouldn't have done as much. Possibly,
Right.
So maybe his mind would have been in the stars too much, and
Right.
possibly.
Well, he was just waiting for you to come along.
Yeah, I guess so. But it's so amazing that long before Galileo, he intuited that the Earth was going around the sun, because that was pretty big. That Galileo. How much later is Galileo? Isn't he at least maybe after? Soon after
Copernicus it's Leonardo and then Copernicus. So it's 40 years before Copernicus that he wrote that the sun does not move. And then I could check the date of Galileo, but I think he's shortly thereafter.
Yeah, because Galileo knew the same thing. And the story on him is that he got in so much trouble, he recanted. I mean, he said, okay, fine.
He was put under house arrest.
And the house arrest, you think to yourself, can you imagine a society where, this is where I often say to people, you should appreciate democracy, because when you have no democracy, some really crazy things can happen. I mean, to be put on house arrest over.
Well, just to give you a take about that too, because it is really relevant to that very important point you just made about democracy, and just to get a sense of it in terms of the evolution of consciousness. So we have the Middle Ages, where it's believed that all knowledge is known and the individual human person is effectively nothing. Right? You're not even allowed to talk to God. You have to go through an agent, basically. And so we have the Gothic cathedral. The architectural message is all the power is up there. And when you walk into, I love those cathedrals, Chartres Cathedral, the Dome Cathedral, but the message is you're nothing, everything's up there. We get to the Renaissance, and all that begins to change. Right now we're saying the divine spark is in each person. So you get Brunelleschi's dome, the dome of the Florence Cathedral, which is heavenly, but when you enter there, you feel that you're part of heaven. And you get this in art, people started to be portrayed as significant subjects. It's no longer just the Virgin Mary and the crucifixion and so on. Now there's humanity is worthy of being on the canvas, and all of a sudden they're in 3 dimensions, showing real emotion, like in the Last Supper. And the first Renaissance painting that Leonardo saw himself in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence is by Masaccio. It's Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. And they're in 3D. And if you were expelled from the garden, you'd be very upset. They're very upset. They look like you and me. So here, architecture, art, it's all changing. And we have this explosion of science, of exploration. We have Magellan and Columbus go out, explore the world, come up with a cure for the plague. We have the telescope, we have the microscope, this amazing expansion of technology. So all of a sudden, we get that, you can see it here, the divine spark is in every person. But it then takes a couple hundred years for the Enlightenment geniuses to say, okay, well, wait a minute. If the divine spark really is in every person, shouldn't there be human rights? Shouldn't there not be slavery? Shouldn't women have the same rights as men? Yeah, of course. So there's all this writing and thinking, and wow, what an idea. And then these guys come along, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. They say, let's put this into the founding document of a nation. First time in human history, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then that experiment proceeds, and oh yeah, well, we have to include people of different races in this. The slavery thing just doesn't go with these principles we said we believed in, and women and people with different gender ideas and sexual preferences, blah blah blah. Everybody is possessed of the divine spark, and we have to sanctify that by giving everyone the right to vote for who will represent them. Right. So this evolution of human consciousness. The Renaissance is a key moment in it as it comes through to us, and it is under grave threat at the moment. So we all have to exercise that right to vote, to say the very least. More so now than ever.
It's exactly true, and yeah, it's exactly true, because it's the once again showing how far ahead of his time he was. Although you can say that he was part of a general movement as well, but the discovery of Uranus, which happens at the end of the 18th century, 1790, that's the actual beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's when technology and science really take off. But the seeds were planted earlier in order for that to happen. Sometimes people think that, you snap your finger and then everything just happens. There's a lead up, and he is, 250 years ahead of his time, because he would have fit right in once, the telescope is discovered, but telescope is what saw Uranus. You can't see Uranus without a telescope, almost. I mean, some people say you can, but it's pretty hard. And yet, when it was discovered, they didn't see it right away. It took a while for that to happen. And the synchronicity is, once humanity sees it, bam, you've got this new energy, which on the one hand is technology, industrial revolution, and Uranus is the ruler of Aquarius, co-ruler of Aquarius, the sign of the people, which is the democratic principle, and the idea that it should be a group decision, consensus. We're all going to agree. And so, yeah, far ahead of his time. And you're totally right, because this whole idea that we're grappling with right now, this flirtation around the world with autocracy, authoritarianism, fascism, that's a total throwback to like literal mob rule, or the idea of a singular individual. I'm amazed that Russia, according to them, it should be a thug in charge, surrounded by a lot of other thugs, and then everybody else gets the crumbs. They're not going to get the results of the prosperity of that country. It's completely backward, as I understand it, right? So it would be great if more Americans, defended the principle instead of.
But if you think about it, at the time of Leonardo, even at the time of Thomas Jefferson, everyone in the world was ruled by a king, a czar, a shah, a pasha, an emperor. Yes. Most of human history is the domination effectively of a mob boss and a mob family oppressing and exploiting the people. Right. So the notion that that isn't the way it is, and that isn't the way it always has been and should be, is relatively new. And what it requires, though, is accepting responsibility for yourself, for your citizenship, for being a good citizen, for contributing to the society. And that requires a certain maturity.
Exactly right. And then you bring in compromise, where you're not always going to get everything you want, and all these different forces, qualities that require you to be human and to understand that it's not just you, it's the group, it's all of us. But yet at the same time, the responsibility to vote and contribute and be in there as part of the government. But I often think that the discovery of Uranus is, in that sense, because of its connection to Aquarius, that's the actual, people say the age of Aquarius. That's what that is. We are in the age of Aquarius.
That is a fascinating.
It requires defending. It requires continued growth to, as the founders put it, to create a more perfect union. Yes, that's the whole. I think they probably knew. They were probably writing the document thinking, we're doing some things here that don't seem to match the document. maybe the future generations will figure it out. It's too hard for us, but yeah.
They did a great job. My favorite description of what they came up with was the Constitution. It's a document written by geniuses so the country could be run by morons. and we survived that. We survived it just barely, but we need some more genius to go around, and hence that's why we want people to learn to think like Leonardo da Vinci.
Well, we can take that up in our next discussion. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to the next one. And I am quite sure people are gonna like this this discussion, with the broad principles as they're related to astrology as well.
Yeah, I learned a lot. Thank you so much. You're a star.
Thank you.
Cheers.